Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, AI Meets Evidence, Practical Applications for Librarians in the Review Workflow, which is sponsored by Sysrev. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Now, I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Okay, next slide, please. Also, if you're interested in library technology, LibTech Insights, or LTI, is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impacts of library and education technology on academic librarians, researchers, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products, including AI, AI literacy, user experience, useful tools, and job profiles, all of which are written by and for librarians. So you can find out more about LTI and read the blog via the links in the chat. You can also sign up for the newsletter there. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. Next slide. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like or would like to be addressed. Next slide. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and today's slides. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Sarah.
Great, thanks so much, Sabrina. Really nice to be here. My name is Sarah Young. I'm a social sciences librarian at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the US. I'm also the head of our evidence synthesis program there. And right now I'm actually serving as a consultant for Sysrev, which is the screening and data extraction platform that we've been using at CMU for many years as our main systematic review and evidence synthesis platform. And I will be spending a bit of time talking about Sysrev later on in the presentation. My colleague, TJ Posada, is also joining me. He's the product lead for Sysrev, and he'll also highlight some things about Sysrev later on in the presentation. So just to sort of get a sense of who's in our audience, there's a few poll questions I'd love for you to answer about your familiarity with systematic reviews, as well as AI and large language models. While you're answering those questions, I just want to also kind of set the stage for the talk today. So the purpose of this presentation is really to offer some practical guidance for navigating what is a pretty complex and rapidly changing area of how to use AI, and specifically in the screening and data extraction steps of a review. I know that as librarians, we aren't often really involved in these steps, but we are often asked to provide advice on them. And I think increasingly being asked for advice on how to semi-automate these very time-consuming tasks using AI. So I hope this talk will provide some useful resources and frameworks for how to advise researchers on using AI without compromising the rigor and integrity of their reviews, and kind of within the bounds of current best practices and recommendations. I'll be pointing out some current research studies, guidelines, recommendations, and other resources that I have found really helpful in my own sort of sense-making about all of this as it evolves, and I hope you all find it useful as well. So today's session is going to cover just a brief bit about systematic reviews and AI in systematic reviews. I'll then sort of talk about kind of 4 different ways that AI and machine learning are used or may be used in the near future in the screening and data extraction steps, including active learning and machine learning classifiers in screening, and LLMs in screening and data extraction. I'll talk about some of the current guidelines and recommendations that exist. I might spend a little bit of time on prompt design and tool selection, but I do really want to highlight how we have used Sysrev, and in particular, large language models in some of our review work at CMU. And then TJ is going to wrap things up with a bit more about Sysrev. Okay, let's see what we have with the poll questions. All right, it looks like we've got some pretty good understanding of systematic reviews. Folks are familiar with artificial intelligence and large language models. Some of you are experts, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these topics as well. And then sort of a mixed ways that folks are using these tools in the evidence synthesis process. Okay, great. This is really helpful just to get a better sense of who our audience is. All right, so given that we're not all experts in systematic review, just want to go over the basics of what a systematic review is. So a systematic review is essentially a literature review, but it applies a very structured and systematic approach to aggregating and analyzing previously published works on a research topic. So it starts with identifying very clearly a research question. This includes defining the criteria that will be used to select whether or not a study is eligible for the review. There is then a very large and often comprehensive search for potential studies that might be related to the topic. These are screened usually by 2 independent reviewers to determine what is eligible based on those predetermined criteria. Then those included studies go through a process of data extraction, whereby the researchers will extract very specific bits of information out of each study. And that sort of makes up the data set that will be used to analyze and synthesize the evidence. In a systematic review, there's always a quality assessment step to understand potential quality issues that might be at play in the included studies. And that is all taken into account in the final synthesis of the evidence. And that might be done with a meta-analysis or other types of qualitative synthesis. There's a lot of other types of reviews that kind of fall into this evidence synthesis umbrella, things like scoping reviews, systematic maps, and rapid reviews that take bits of these different steps and apply them for this structured approach as well. So what sets systematic reviews apart from a traditional literature review? I think in some ways it's about how those findings are used in practice. So systematic reviews are relatively high stakes research products that are used for real world decision making. This might be policy making, it might be patient care decisions about how to design a social program, ultimately that affect real people's lives. So they really need to use rigorous methods. They need to be as comprehensive as possible, finding all the available evidence on a topic. Bias needs to be minimized as much as possible throughout the research process, and transparency and reproducibility need to be emphasized as well. Librarians are key to supporting systematic reviews. There's actually quite a bit of evidence that having a librarian involved in a systematic review improves the quality and rigor of the systematic review. Librarians are typically involved in supporting the search steps of review that really sort of underlie the whole foundation of the rest of the review process. They're involved in reporting and writing up of those search methods. And then, as I mentioned, we're often also asked for advice about methodological aspects of the entire review process. So we are often asked for advice about screening, software and screening, data extraction, how to go about that process. And then sometimes we're in a position also to offer access and even training on tools and software that can be used in systematic review. So why is AI needed here? Like I said, these are very rigorous aiming to be as transparent and comprehensive as possible. Yet we're now sort of facing this situation where we have just overwhelming volumes of literature. This is leading to even longer times to completion for these already quite long endeavors. Systematic reviews are estimated to take somewhere between 12 and 18 months on average. And this is 12 to 18 months that decision makers are waiting for information and answers that they can use to inform things like, again, policy, patient care. So we really need to turn to technologies today to think about how can we improve efficiency, and AI is really a tool that we can make use of for this purpose. I just want to point out AI has been used for decades in evidence synthesis. I'm going to be focusing on two sort of aspects of AI. One that is pretty well established, so that's different kinds of machine learning techniques and screening prioritization. And then the other that is very new, so generative AI and large language models. Speaking of sort of this new technology, right? We all know generative AI, large language models have really just changed the way we interact with information, the way we search for and discover research. So much about the work that we do as librarians is impacted by these changing technologies. And it is very daunting and overwhelming to keep on top of all of these changes. And I want to just highlight some of the really wonderful resources that have helped me navigate this very sort of complex and, again, rapidly changing area. So if you aren't already familiar with these folks and these resources, highly recommend checking them out. So Erin Tay, who's a wonderful librarian at Singapore Management University, has a really useful blog called Musings About Librarianship. This is really sort of broadly about AI and research discovery. He does get a little bit technical, but in a very accessible way. Really recommend his blog and his YouTube channel for learning just sort of like the sort of underpinnings of all of these technologies and how they impact the way we search. Farhad Shakraneh is out of the University of Oxford, another thought leader in this space. Great blog, great YouTube channel. Really focuses a bit more on AI and evidence synthesis. If you're interested in learning about how generative AI and large language models can be used in our searching in the evidence synthesis process, really recommend this very recent webinar that was put on by NNLM with Margaret Foster and her wonderful team at Texas A&M. Again, focused on searching and sort of the ways that generative AI and LLMs can be used there. And then finally, just keeping tabs on things like Cochrane, Campbell, JBI, Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, and the information, the recommendations that are coming out of those organizations. And I'll talk about a bit about those later on in the presentation. Okay, before I sort of dive into kind of the nuts and bolts of using AI in screening and data extraction, I do just want to sort of point out and sort of have us keep this in mind throughout the talk. Are the trade-offs worth it? And this really is in really thinking about mainly generative AI and large language models. We know that large language models and these commercial models have potential environmental impacts. There may be risks of algorithmic bias that we don't even fully understand. And then even sort of ethical considerations around the use of those commercial models of protected copyrighted information to build their tools. All of these things are really important to think about as we weigh whether or not using them actually is worth the trade-offs in terms of time savings. So I just want to sort of put that out there and have us sort of keep that in mind as we work through this presentation. Okay, so like I said, I'm really sort of boiling down this, again, very complex topic to 4 different ways that I think AI and machine learning are either already being used or have the potential for use with LLMs being introduced. That is active learning and screening. machine learning classifiers, and here I'm mainly talking about the randomized control classifier, control trial classifier from Cochrane, and then LLMs being used in eligibility screening and LLMs used in data extraction. So again, in terms of screening, this is the step where you have all these search results from the databases, and now your researchers need to screen through all of those records and decide what is eligible or ineligible for the review based on these predetermined criteria. This can often mean screening thousands and thousands of search results, and the expectation is that 2 reviewers are independently screening all of those records. So active machine learning is now, I would say, routinely used in the screening process. We also call it prioritized screening. As reviewers are making decisions about eligibility, a machine learning model is being trained kind of in the background to learn what is relevant and what is irrelevant, and then applying these predictions to all of the unscreened records. This can be used in one of 3 ways, either just speeding up screening. So in this way, the records are sorted by their likelihood of inclusion based on that machine learning model. So more likely to be included records are surfaced at the top in order down to the least likely to be included. And this sort of sorting actually kind of makes screening a little bit more efficient. So I think that's probably the most common way this is used. Another possibility is you could get to a point where your machine learning model is trained sufficiently such that you are confident to replace one of the human screeners with sort of the predictions that that model has provided. So moving from a dual 2-screener approach to a single screener approach. Again, you can imagine this could be quite time savings when we're talking about thousands of articles. There's actually quite a bit of evidence to suggest that a very well-trained model could be used to just bulk exclude records without even screening them, without a high risk of losing relevant studies. I think this is done less frequently, but it is possible. A few things to consider about this. Like I said, this is pretty well established. I would guess that most systematic reviews use active learning in some way or another, whether they know it or not, because these models are just built into many of the tools that folks are using, things like Covidence, Rayan, Sysrev. One thing to note is to use these tools to, for example, bulk exclude or move to a single human screener. It really does require a lot of human screening. And this, I think, is one small advantage of large language models, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's also debates around how to decide when to stop screening. So if you are going to use this method to actually bulk exclude records or move to a single human screener, you need to think about, well, when do you do that, right? When do you stop screening? And there's no real consensus on how to do this. There's a lot of different methods out there. This slide points out 2 nice reviews that I have found useful in kind of understanding what the different approaches might be to deciding when to stop. And I think the real takeaway here is that it's really important to plan ahead. So if you're working with researchers who really want to use prioritized screening to limit or sort of to stop screening at some point, and again, move to a single human screener, for example, they really need to think ahead about what method they're going to use to decide when to stop, because the way you screen could impact the different options you have downstream. So depending on the software you're using or the method you're using for screening, you may end up limiting yourself in terms of how you can use these different stopping methods. So thinking about this ahead, I think is really important. Okay, so another way machine learning is used, I think, again, probably fairly routinely in systematic reviews is with a classifier. So this is a machine learning model that has been trained on many, many thousands of human labeled or human reviewed articles. to create a model that can sort of just classify articles into groups. This is often done with study design, and in particular, most often done with randomized control trials. So Cochrane developed a randomized control trial classifier based on hundreds of thousands of human-labeled articles. And this classifier is actually built into some platforms, like Covidence, for example, where you can pull in your search results and it will just automatically identify the records that are most likely to be randomized control trials, and reviewers can proceed with those. Very useful, however, limited use when you're talking about reviews that aren't on randomized control trials, which in my case is probably most of the reviews I work on. But I do want to point out that this is another really interesting and useful way that machine learning can help with efficiency of reviews. All right, so the rest of this talk, I'm going to sort of shift to talk about large language models, which is still, again, quite new in its application in evidence synthesis. This is a really nice scoping review that was done not too long ago that looked at the research on large language models for application in different steps of systematic review. And these folks sort of grouped these different studies based on how promising they were in terms of how promising the LLM seemed to be for that step of the review. And I just want to call your attention to 3 different boxes in this slide. First of all, the bottom row here is the non-promising research. And interestingly, there's a cluster of studies in the search step. So in fact, it's been shown a few times that generative AI is actually not very good at creating search strategies that are sufficiently rigorous or comprehensive for systematic review. That's great news for us librarians. There's a lot of different ways we can use LLMs to help us construct our searches, but you cannot just turn this step over to AI. It just simply isn't good enough. You really need the human expertise. So I'll leave that there because we're going to focus on these other 2 steps, screening and data extraction. And you can see that the research is indicating some promising results for those steps. So in terms of screening, I think what I've mostly seen done so far is the construction of a fairly complex prompt for the LLM, where you are providing it the context of the systematic review, the list of your eligibility criteria, and then some clear instructions about what to do with those criteria. So when to choose yes and when to choose no. What I've seen done is that this is being used to sort of do a process of testing and validation against a bunch of human screened records. A really nice kind of use case for this is an update to a review or a living systematic review, where you've already done an initial sort of manual human approach to your review. You have many human reviewed articles. You can use those to test and validate a prompt. And once you've achieved a certain threshold of accuracy, you can then just use that prompt on, say, the review update. And that prompt can be used to just bucket the rest of the articles into include and exclude, potentially saving quite a bit of screening time. A really nice example of this is this study by Homier et al., again, very recent, where they developed and evaluated prompts for screening in a living systematic review. This was dopamine interventions for anhedonia. They used GPT-4o for the title abstract screening. They developed and tested these prompts, and they were able to achieve 100% recall. So in other words, the prompt was able to identify 100% of the records that humans had identified as eligible for the review. They were then able to use this prompt on the remaining 12,000 records, two updates, again, showing very significant time savings. So just a nice example. There are probably other good examples out there, but this is one that I've leaned on quite a bit. A few things to be aware of in sort of taking this approach. When you are testing and validating a prompt against human screened records, you want to make sure that the human screening was also consistent. So there should have been high inter-rater reliability between the two human reviewer decisions. They should have been kind of on the same page with their understanding of the eligibility criteria. If the criteria are not clear to humans, they're not going to be clear to the LLM. Another thing to consider is that we need to remove missing and probably even to some degree short abstracts. So in other words, any records that are missing an abstract or have kind of insufficiently short abstracts need to be removed and manually screened. They just won't have enough information for an LLM to make a decision. Also, you want to think about what is your threshold for performance, considering metrics like accuracy, recall, specificity, and precision. What is sort of the cutoff where you're comfortable moving forward with that prompt? And this really gets to your tolerance for missed articles and sort of the context of your review. So for example, if you're doing a systematic review where patient care is at stake, 100% recall is probably what you're shooting for. If you're doing something like a large scoping review or systematic map where a few missed studies won't really impact the results, you might be able to get away with something a little less accurate. Another interesting sort of metric that we don't think about with other types of technologies is consistency. So these models are probabilistic, they're not deterministic. In other words, if you run the same prompt on the same records multiple times, you might get different answers. And so sort of understanding how consistent the prompt is across multiple runs on the same records is a useful metric to sort of understand and measure before moving forward with that prompt. And then another thing to consider is data contamination. So this is a scenario where your test and validation data that you're using to design your prompt may actually be contained in the model's training data. So right, if we're using something like GPT-4o that may have been trained, I can't remember, most recently, maybe 2024, and you're using some data from a systematic review that was published open access in 2023, it's quite possible the model already kind of knows what the answer should be because that data is in the training data. So important to consider when you're sort of developing your test and validation data sets for training or designing your prompt, make sure it's not something that would be in the model's training data, ideally maybe unpublished review data. Okay, so that's sort of screening. Moving to LLMs in semi-automating data extraction. Again, this is a step where once you have a set of included studies, you are extracting many different bits of information from each study in a very systematic way. This might be information about the populations that were studied, information about the interventions or intervention effectiveness, lots of different bits of information. Because it's just sort of all this varied information, you can't really go about testing and fully validating a prompt for all of these different items. It just wouldn't be feasible. And so the approach here instead is very much a sort of human in the loop, AI assisted approach. This is where we design a prompt. We're not fully testing and validating, but we sort of use that prompt as one of our data extractors and then have a human checking the accuracy and completeness of that data extraction. So this is probably kind of the recommended approach, I think, moving forward for using LLMs in this step. A really nice example of this is this recent study comparing human-only data extraction approach with an AI-assisted data extraction approach. They did this using Claude Pro across 6 systematic reviews and healthcare interventions. They extracted over 9,000 data elements from 63 studies. And In fact, they found that the AI-assisted approach had fewer incorrect extractions than the human-only approach. And this is really interesting. I mean, I think we know that human-led data extraction is somewhat error-prone. And this study at least tells us that an AI-assisted approach may actually be more accurate. On top of that, also saving quite a bit of time. So this is really interesting and shows some real promise for this kind of application. So what are the things we need to think about in data extraction? Here's where hallucinations come into play. This is where the large language model is returning just wrong, hallucinated answers. This is going to be especially important to think about when you might have information that just isn't present in the articles from which you're extracting data. So this is something that needs to be considered here. Also PDF readability. So this is going to come into play certainly with things like gray literature, other types of documents that might not be machine readable, and the LLM just simply won't be able to extract information. So you need to make sure that the PDFs that you're working with are machine readable, and that the data that you are trying to extract is also accessible to the LLM. There may be scenarios where data is embedded in figures in ways that an LLM has a hard time sort of extracting information. So again, just being aware of those considerations. And then also licensing restrictions, right? We often think about, the concerns around uploading a full text PDF to a commercial chatbot, say like ChatGPT, and what kinds of restrictions there might be on our ability to do that with this copyrighted material. And I think the main thing to think about is that generally speaking, you can't do this in a way where the model is then using that data for its training. And generally speaking, you can turn this off, whether you're working with ChatGPT directly or using some sort of software. You can usually make sure that your settings are such that the model isn't training on your data. And this should address most of these concerns. But still, this is a complex and sort of as yet unlitigated kind of issue. And I think we need to sort of just keep aware of how things evolve in this regard. Okay, so I just want to talk about recommendations, right? So these sort of initial studies that are emerging do sort of indicate that LLMs really have the potential to add efficiency to both screening and data extraction in ways that potentially don't impact the rigor and integrity of reviews. So are there recommendations and guidelines for this? And the answer is now yes. These are relatively new. In fact, it was just last week that Cochrane, Campbell, JBI, and Collaboration for Environmental Evidence released their first position statement for the use of AI in evidence synthesis. Important to note, this is not just LLMs and generative AI. This is AI broadly. And they say that AI can be used in evidence synthesis as long as it is demonstrated that the rigor of the review isn't compromised. It must be done with human oversight, transparent reporting, and the use must be justifiable. They also note that one should adhere to RAISE. So RAISE is the responsible use of AI in evidence synthesis. This is a 3-part set of recommendations, guidelines, available in Open Science Framework. This is a really great document to take a look at. It's been very helpful for me, again, to kind of make sense of what is okay, what is not okay in terms of applying AI in a rigorous systematic review. So just some highlights from the RAISE recommendations. The first document really covers the different key actors in this broad evidence synthesis ecosystem and what the different responsibilities those actors have in terms of using AI in this way. The other documents really get more into sort of the practicalities of first developing, testing, and validating AI tools. And here I'll point out that their sort of use of AI tools is interesting. When we think about, for example, developing a prompt to help us screen records in a systematic review, we are invalidating and testing that prompt. We are developing an AI tool. And so these methods can be applied just in that context. And again, this is AI broadly, so not just LLMs, but they do have some really useful specific information about LLMs and generative AI. This document also has a really nice summary of the different performance metrics that we can consider. There are recommendations for how we can report and the development and use of AI tools. And then finally, some guidance for selecting existing AI tools. And this includes a nice section on some of the ethical and legal considerations. So highly recommend taking a look at these if you haven't already done so. I'm gonna, for the sake of time, I'm not gonna spend too much time on the prompt design. This could be a whole other 1 hour webinar, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, but lots of different techniques and approaches to designing prompts, kind of an art and science here. And there's some really nice sort of frameworks for thinking about this, and also some useful resources, especially coming out of libraries. This is a guide I really like that goes into a lot of the different approaches and techniques. And then some more slightly technical papers that kind of frame this more in the context of evidence synthesis. All right, I kind of want to turn to kind of the logistics of how we actually do this in practice. Again, this is all at this point focused on the application of large language models. We can use a chatbot user interface directly. So for example, you can go to ChatGPT, again, making sure that you've turned off the training of the model, logged in, and upload a PDF and ask questions about the PDF. This is obviously fairly tedious and not very streamlined with potentially hundreds of PDFs or even 10 PDFs. So more streamlined would be using an API or even running a model locally on your own computer in a programming environment. A lot of folks are taking this approach, but of course this involves sort of having some sort of programming coding skills, and not all researchers do. So another kind of thing that we can recommend to researchers, especially teams that don't have folks with programming, technical programming skills, is to think about a built-for-purpose tool. So these are the screening and data extraction platforms that already exist that have implemented large language models. And I think Sysrev was probably one of the first to do this. And it is the tool that, like I said, we have been using for many years at CMU. So Sysrev is, like I said, screening and data extraction platform originally designed to support rigorous systematic review. But one of the things that we really love about it is that it's very adaptable, and you could basically do any kind of literature review or document review workflow using Sysrev. So it lends itself really well to these emerging methods where people want to semi-automate or do different kinds of things that are a little bit outside of the traditional workflow. Sysrev also has a really nice sort of focus on open science, makes it very easy to share and reuse review data. It's also very easy to export all of your data. There's an API that allows for interoperability with downstream software tools. So these are just a few of the reasons we love Sysrev in general. In terms of AI, Sysrev is, again, its flexibility, I think, allows for pretty much any of the workflows that I've discussed today, you could implement here. This includes the prioritized screening. So there's an active learning model that's trained as reviewers make decisions. I think you could probably implement any of the stopping rule options that I mentioned earlier in Sysrev. It, about a year and a half ago, implemented large language models with a feature called the auto labeler. It's a really flexible feature that allows folks to use Sysrev to semi-automate screening or data extraction with human oversight. So again, sort of keeping in mind the recommendations that this be done with some sort of human involvement. And then the public projects, so the sharing of your review, make it very easy to be transparent about the way you used AI in your review. So lots of different ways Sysrev can support this work in alignment with a lot of the recommendations that are coming out. So I'm going to walk through an example of how we have started to use large language models at CMU in our review work. And this particular example of a rapid review on child online safety. So this application is in the citation searching step of a review. So if you're familiar with systematic review, you know that when you have a set of included studies after all of that screening, there's always a step at the end where you do a forward and backward citation search to find any potential other studies that might have been missed in those initial database searches. This can often add a bunch more screening at the end of a review, just sort of elongating this already long review process. Another thing to think about with these citation searches is that there's often many very irrelevant results in this set of search results. So we thought this was a really great use case for generative AI. One, it's fairly low stakes in the sense that it's just a supplemental search method. It's not the key search method. And in fact, in a rapid review, this step is often skipped altogether. And like I said, I think because of the many very irrelevant records that can come up in these searches, a large language model seems like something that would be actually quite good at sort of sifting out included from excluded results. So kind of checks all the boxes with the recommendations, minimal impact to rigor or integrity. This, in this case, fairly justifiable use. This was a policy relevant rapid review where sort of answers were needed soon. We're doing this with human oversight, and we'll be able to transparently report the use of AI with our public project sharing. I want to note this was done in collaboration with my wonderful colleagues at the CMU Libraries and then the 2 faculty members at CMU Africa who led this rapid review project. So this is kind of a busy slide, but just to give you a sense of how this could be implemented in Sysrev. First, we tested our prompt against the records that had been initially reviewed in the rapid review until we achieved what we felt was a sufficient level of accuracy. We then did our citation searches, brought those into Sysrev, and used that same prompt to screen the records. I'll go into this in a bit more detail here. So this is just a quick view of Sysrev. If you're familiar with other software, this should look fairly familiar, where you have a title abstract, and then over here on the left, what's called a label, where you can choose whether or not the article should be included or excluded. Labels in Sysrev are kind of the foundation of building a review in Sysrev. It's almost like building kind of like a survey of questions that reviewers answer about each article. Very flexible and a way that you can manage both eligibility screening and data extraction. So here's a view of our include-exclude prompt. You can see it's actually quite detailed. You can add as much information to this description as you like. And this description becomes the prompt that the LLM uses to make decisions. We provide context for the review, our screening criteria, and then instructions for what to do with those criteria. This is a view of the settings in Sysrev for the auto labeler, where we tell Sysrev to turn this label on for the auto labeler, whether or not to read full text or just titles and abstracts, and then what model to choose. You have the option of choosing GPT-4o or Gemini 2.5 Flash. Once you have run the auto labeler on records that have already been reviewed by humans, you end up with a really nice auto label report that allows you to quickly assess the performance of the auto labeler. and how it did against those human reviewed records. We can look at the different metrics. We can explore, the different articles, how the answers might have agreed or disagreed with humans, and then make adjustments to our prompt accordingly. So in this particular review, we ended up using this kind of 5-point scale where we turned our yes/no eligibility prompt into this 5-point scale of relevance. So we had the LLM, instead of just saying yes or no, include, exclude, we had it give us a score of 1 highly relevant to 5 not relevant. And this allowed us to add a little bit of nuance and sensitivity to our screening. This comes from a nice study by Sandner, 2024. And we could implement this very easily in Sysrev with something called a categorical label. This is just a label where we have the LLM or the human choosing from a set of predetermined answers. So in this case, 1 to 5. We brought in, it was 923 results that we got from our citation searching. And with the auto labeler, it ended up labeling 799 of those with a score of 5, not relevant, which we could confidently exclude without looking at these records. So it ended up saving a considerable amount of time in this review project. This link will take you right to the Sysrev project. There is detailed information there, a link to an OSF project with all the information to sort of understand the workflow and how we carried this out for this review. I think with that, I am turning it over to my colleague TJ to kind of wrap us up and tell us a little bit more about Sysrev.
Thanks, Sarah. Great timing. I was answering as many of the Q&A questions as I could. So that was really nice timing. Appreciate it. So this slide didn't actually exist a couple of days ago, but then when we saw the spread of different organizations who would be attending this webinar, wanted to add it in just to say things beyond what you might find in your usual or traditional systematic review that are also capable with LLMs. And so what you can see on the screen is a project that I and we in Silica are actually working on right now. So for those who don't know, we actually launched Sysrev about 10 years ago, but we originally built it as our own internal research tool. And so what this shows is that the auto labeler is actually able to extract an entire table of information from full text PDFs. What's really important about this is the way that it's done, mostly in that it retains the data provenance. And so one thing that Sarah talked about earlier in this presentation was due to the scale of using LLMs for data extraction. There's really no good way to truly and 100% completely test your prompt. At some point, you're going to decide that it's good enough and let it do its thing. And that really means that for transparency and for rigor, you need to verify the extraction. And so one thing that we do and others do as well is something called data provenance, where you can take each piece of data and tie it back to its original source. What that looks for with us is the article ID, which you can see in the albeit very tiny snippet from the data export. But basically, each piece of data can be tied back to the individual article from which it came. And so if there is a piece of data or an article that for whatever reason, and there are many good reasons, you decide are worth human verification, you're able to very quickly go to that article, see what the auto labeler extracted, and either verify or adapt it as you so need to. And this is something that is very important, right? Particularly for, again, rigor, we want to know that the data that we're using for whatever downstream analysis we may be doing is trustworthy, was actually extracted correctly. And so by combining LLMs with proper data provenance and human in the loop, you're able to take advantage of their power, but still make sure that all of your downstream conclusions are accurate. And so taking 2 steps back, kind of just want to talk broadly about things that are happening within the software space with respect to literature reviews and systematic reviews. And obviously some bias here as a representative of Sysrev, but other software tools have their own take on this as well. And again, this is maybe perhaps just something that you can help keep in mind when you look at the different types of solutions out there and see which one fits your project. And that may not be the same answer for every research project that you're working on. But so literature reviews are evolving. It's not just your standard systematic review. Not all documents these days are publications. We've seen reviews on JSON files. We've seen reviews that have complicated workflows where, depending on an initial sort, different types of extraction forms take place. Something that happens very much in the field that we play is that an in vivo study and an in vitro study will have very different types of information. You need to do that sort before you can do that extraction. And so whichever platform you choose, make sure that it is something that actually enables all the types of literature review that are now commonplace, particularly if it's for an entire organization and not just research project specific. The other truth is that LLMs are just incredibly powerful. That project that I showed you beforehand, that is something that I was able to do from a web app with just point and click and typing. There was no true coding necessary. And so I would suggest that whatever platform you so choose, again, gives you the ability to leverage these LLMs, but also do so in a way that allows you to have that transparency and rigor, and most importantly, auditability. Data provenance is extremely important when we're using automated extract data that was automatically extracted for downstream analysis and for, as Sarah mentioned before, policy making. The more important the conclusion is insofar as how it's being used, the more important it is that we are confident in whatever automation we've used so far. And lastly, these things don't need to be expensive. LLMs have drastically reduced in their price. Obviously, the different providers of said LLMs often are introducing new models. With those new models come a pricing tier, but then everything else moves down. Software in general has gotten quite cheap. Cloud and storage costs are not what they were even 10 years ago. And so one other thing that we must consider is making these types of technologies actually available and access more equitable to all parties who may be interested in using these technologies. So for example, one title abstract label starts at 1 cent. And again, that's really just a pass-through. That's what we're charged. There are other business models. There are other ways that folks have tried to package LLMs. But again, they themselves are not that expensive. Cloud storage is not that expensive. And so when reviewing different technologies, perhaps look for one that allows you to scale with actual usage, where you're not prepaying for a bunch of credits that go unused. Rather, you're actually paying for the technology as you take advantage of it. Quick, small plugs. So we've been putting on a 3-part evidence synthesis webinar series with Neil Hadaway. If you're not familiar with Neil Hadaway, give him a Google. You'll quickly find that he has been involved in a number of international projects, is well published, has even taught many virtual and in-person series on evidence synthesis. We've already had our first webinar, but the next two, one is on Monday, the next one, or the one after that, will be in December. If you're interested in open science and open evidence as a topic, highly recommend it. These do not talk about Sysrev at all. It is really just Neil talking about the philosophy and the practicality of open evidence. Those are links that we'll make available for folks who might be interested. And then if anyone is interested in learning about Sysrev, we also have monthly webinars, just to say that the next one will be December 2nd. Everyone here is more than welcome to join us. If you'd like to learn more about how the software actually operates, that is a better place than perhaps here to really get into the nitty-gritty of what makes us unique. Last but not least, definitely not least, just want to say thank you to everyone who attended. Really appreciate your time, taking the time to join us today, and thank you to Choice for giving us this opportunity. I've left a few of the Q&A questions to the end in hopes that we could address them live, as opposed to me quickly typing what I could. The first one, the most upvoted one, we knew that this question would be asked, and I thought that it was important to actually save it for the end and address it. I'm going to combine the top 2 voted questions because they're related. So what about energy and water consumption of AI data centers? And forgive me, I'm paraphrasing. I'm very interested in ethical aspects of LLMs and what we generally call AI tools when it causes real harm to communities and individuals and contributes to climate change. How can we justify using it? I've known that those questions were posted, so I'll answer first while Sarah has a chance to collect her thoughts. I think this is a very important question. This goes back to what Ray's kind of discussed as justifiable use. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure, or one needs to be confident in their own usage of these tools. Everyone is going to have different thresholds for what is justifiable. But at the end of the day, I would say, well, would you use chat to answer that question, right? I think there are some folk who are more comfortable asking chat every question that comes to their mind. Some folk really want to save using an LLM for something that is important or time costly. We tend to work on projects that are patient-facing or population-facing, deal with chemical safety, toxicology, things where the answer is very important and having an accurate answer is very important, but also having an accurate answer sooner is very important. The research project that I showed you, the table that we're pulling from, we're actually doing a version automatically and manually. The automatic version, and we've checked all the data, was done in a couple of hours, and that was mostly prompt fine-tuning. The manual version of that is going to take several PhDs and postdocs and professors weeks. Now, they're not working 40 hours per week on this one project. They have other tasks as well, but it's going to take a really long time. And so for the use case that is chemical safety and environmental safety, albeit from a chemical point of view, it is important that we get these answers sooner than later, particularly when we understand the time delay between having the answer, having the publication, having the publication reach the policymaker, having the policymaker have um, a committee and then come to a conclusion and a decision that actually makes its way out into the population. It's a really long time delay between research and effect. And so I personally believe that there are certain cases where that any shortening of that time delay is at least worth considering. Again, this is something where I would suggest that it's something that everyone needs to ask themselves. But it's worth discussing, and whether or not you particularly enjoyed my answer, I wanted to make sure that it was something that we addressed out loud, just because, again, it is worth the consideration. Sarah, anything to add there?
I mean, nothing to add, but I think, yeah, basically it's a matter of weighing the costs and benefits of using the LLMs, where the benefits are probably mostly about getting the evidence into the hands of decision makers more quickly. Yes, agreed that it is something to be kept in mind for sure.
Are you reading? Well, I'll read the question out loud anyways. Okay. So in the Homiar example, were they able to demonstrate that the results were not influenced by contaminated data? In other words, published systematic reviews, which are used for the purposes of comparison, are often ingested by the LLM, and it reproduces the existing citation linkages rather than purely applying the screening criteria with perfect accuracy. Is this the case in this study?
Yeah, this study, I believe they addressed that. I think I can't remember if they addressed it sort of just in the potential limitations, or if they addressed it by noting that specifically the review data had not been public, or the sort of test and validation data wasn't public. I'd have to look back in particular, but it was definitely, this potential issue was definitely addressed in that paper. Yeah, and data contamination is something to definitely consider when you're developing your test and validation data sets. Thanks for that question.
One thing I might add there, and this is very much knowable for each model and for each iteration of each entity that makes the model's version, is when the training data was, we'll say, capped, right? So for GPT-4o, I believe it's December 2023. Anything that was published after December 2023 that cannot be accessed via the public internet is actually unknown to that model. Now, there are lots of things that obviously it can learn by combing the internet, but for better or for worse, a lot of full text PDFs are not included in that particular data set. And so while this doesn't address your specific example, it is also worth considering whether or not it would be in their training data just based off of timing. For tools that aren't kind of the public ones that we think about, then particularly if they're proprietary, then perhaps you could ensure that specific publications were not included, but that would take access to the actual model and the training set. There was a lot of discussion about identifying retracted papers. I think we can all agree that Zotero does a great job of this. RefWorks as well. Let me just move those out. I like that Raise moved from Gen AI to AI, but unfortunately not everybody in our community did. We still use LLMs and CPTs interchangeably with machine learning, deep learning, and other computing that support research synthesis. We keep talking about technology that generates content, not improves evidence retrieval. No real question there, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think terminology is really important, and I think we often nowadays sort of equate AI with generative AI, when in fact it's definitely a much broader, suite of technologies, some of which have been used for decades in evidence synthesis. So I don't know, I'm not sure if I'm sort of addressing the point specifically, but yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I think we might be at time.
I was about to do a quick check as well.
Yeah, I did just put my email address in the chat there. Feel free to email me. I mean, if there's questions, unfortunately, I can't see the Q&A, but oh, there it is. If there's ones that I haven't addressed, I'm happy to attempt to address them on email, and happy to send slides along as well. Yeah, I might gather up these questions from Q&A and see if I can dig into them a bit.
Great. Yeah. We'll include the Q&A transcript, Sarah and TJ, so you all can follow up as needed. And I'll just say thanks so much to Sarah and TJ for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with links to the recording and today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session.
Thanks again, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.